Welcome. I have with me today a very special guest. His name is Justin Faerman, and Justin is a pioneer in consciousness research, the nature of reality, and the art of living in flow state. He's also the co-founder of the Flow Consciousness Institute. Justin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right, I wanted to just start off with, I believe the number one thing modern physics and science is missing is the understanding of consciousness. So I'm wondering what thoughts you have about that.
Yeah, that's a deep one. I could talk for a while about that.
Yeah, I thought we'd start deep.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting what's going on now, actually, compared to, even 3 or 4 years ago, the interest in consciousness has ramped up significantly. And I think a lot of that is being driven by AI, because that, to really understand how AI works, you kind of need to have, I mean, at least on a is this sentient or not level, right? You need to have like a reliable, accurate, measurable understanding and definition of consciousness, and society doesn't really have that yet. So a lot of the circles I'm in are suddenly talking about consciousness, and suddenly everyone's an expert in consciousness or has a theory of consciousness, and it's been a really interesting experience to go from like maybe 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, when it was just like a bunch of academics and people maybe on the spiritual path and whatnot. And so yeah, I think this is really, it's interesting that society is talking about it now, because what I believe that when you really understand the centrality of consciousness to all experience on every level of reality, it's like, how could people have not been interested in this before? Because it's just such an integral aspect of what it means to be alive, and like how to live successfully and thrive and whatnot. So if you have a more specific question, we can dial that
Yeah.
in a bit. But yeah, I think that there's like one of the things that I'm aware of is like this kind of clashing perspective on what consciousness is, and that's trying to come to either one is trying to win, or there's some kind of synthesis that's trying to emerge of like what actually is consciousness.
Okay. Yeah, I started broad, so we can start to narrow back in here. But yeah, it seems like humanity, for whatever reason, does not fully accept or understand consciousness. Um, and let me ask you this: if humanity did fully understand consciousness, how would that change how we live in the world and how we see each other, how we interact with each other, and how we co-create in this world?
I mean, I think that's a tricky question, because it depends on the definition that humanity arrives at for what consciousness is. Because it's my belief that if humanity, and again, I do believe that there is a real accurate, objective, kind of absolute truth about consciousness. Um, and however, it's totally possible to miss the mark, and in my opinion, and to take on a definition that seems correct but maybe isn't totally correct. And if in my view, if humanity was to take on like a very strict materialist, reductionist, physicalist definition of consciousness, I think it could actually have some kind of negative impact. It's possible that it might turn out positive as well, because you never quite know how things are going to turn out. But I think it could have negative impact, because it could justify like a lot of beliefs that could potentially be harmful and used to like justify like all kinds of things that could have negative or unintended consequences. Whereas I believe that if we were to take a more like idealist philosophically view of consciousness, that and see it in a perhaps maybe a more spiritual lens, right? And more integral, holistic lens, that it could actually be really beneficial potentially as well. So I think it just all depends on which side of the spectrum we land on.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's more you want to explore on one of those wavelengths.
Yeah, we're definitely starting off broad here. Um, I also want to get into AI here as well. And then I'd like to discuss your ideas about what you've learned about intuition in the subconscious. So Well, why don't we start why don't we go more into the conversation with AI, since you mentioned that. Um, what so like AI is just kind of recently coming out, at least it's been released to the public. Um, what kind of impact do you think this will have on humanity? And where do you see this going, like maybe 20 years from now? Like what do you think life's going to look like with artificial intelligence, like when we're really using it like on a large scale? What kind of world is that going to be like?
Yeah, well, just read my crystal ball and
Big
predict the
questions
future.
here.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll probably speak a little bit generally because, there's just so many ways that this could unfold. But, I think that if we look at the past of how humanity's dealt with and used like major technological innovations, it's probably going to be like 50-50, like 50% positive good uses, 50% negative uses or unintended consequences, from like, racing into a new technology. I think that I can see scenarios. I mean, like even with what it's capable of now, I can see scenarios in which like it enables a lot of innovation and potentially even personal and societal transformation. And it allows us to work faster and to stop doing so much busy work and focus on things that are more fulfilling and creative and maybe higher up Maslow's hierarchy and stuff. So I think that there could be a lot of positive impacts. It could lead to a lot of scientific discoveries and help us to clean up the oceans and the planet. It can do a lot of those things, I think. um, I think that there's potentially limits on what it itself will do, but I think it can help accelerate those things, right? On the negative side of the coin, like, it could potentially amplify the destructiveness that a single person could have or a government could have, that you kind of get into like Orwellian 1984 type scenarios where it's like, yeah, like the more power someone has at a few clicks, and the more sophisticated and capable like an AI becomes, like the more it exponentially increases negative impacts that are possible too, because any technology can go either direction, right? So like it can be used for good, and somebody could also use it to develop new viruses and release them into the world and all these things. So I think that it's going to be like a magnifying factor on whatever directions human consciousness currently leans in. And then, I guess the elephant in the room is like, well, what about AGI, right? Like, what about if this, AI becomes conscious, and then what will its motivations be? Will those be positive or negative? That's a little bit of a side conversation in my mind, because I don't think that that's actually possible for it to become conscious in the same way that a human is. And so, or even, like an animal or some other kind of like organic biological or organic intelligence. And so I think that some of those conversations can kind of sidetrack from, maybe the more important conversation is like, how do we develop this responsibly and use it responsibly?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a tool. I believe it's a neutral tool that's just going to amplify our consciousness, basically. And if we're coming from positives, wanting to create a positive, sustainable world, then it'll amplify that, and then vice versa. There's also the negative part as well. My mind kind of
Yeah.
goes to like Star Wars and that kind of reality where like the negative side is creating a Death Star and like destroying planets, but then like the positive side as well, where we can create a beautiful, sustainable world together, in harmony with nature and things like that. So I've recently heard you talk about, let's see, let me some sort a little bit of conflict or two different ideas of AI, and you mentioned um, that there's some disagreements around it. Yeah, can AI be conscious? And I was reading your post, and you seem pretty passionate about this, that you don't think it's possible for AI to ever be conscious. Why is that discussion happening right now? And why is that important?
I mean, I think that I think that one of the reasons why it's happening is because people are concerned about its motivations. And there's a lot of like famous, well known and respected AI researchers that are like, hey, if we don't keep this thing in check, or if it's conscious, it might have negative motivations and destroy us or create some negative outcome. So obviously, there's that kind of like fear driven narrative that makes people worried about it. And I think also another wavelength, is people are just like curious what it's going to be capable of, and like what it's going to be able to do for us or not. And then there's just like the general conversation of like, well, what is consciousness? What is even conscious or not? And this is something that humanity's been grappling with forever, and certainly no less in modern times. And like in with all the advents in like physics and quantum physics and stuff, you know, this question gets brought up a lot because there are some findings in physics that suggest that, it's affected by consciousness. And like when you get down deep enough, it's all just energy. So then what? Is there some kind of intelligence behind it all? And there's different physicists fall on different side of the coin. So I think that it's just kind of kicking that into gear. And I also think too, and this is like more on, kind of my unique perspective on things, that I think humanity is getting to a point in its evolutionary development, like as a species, where like it's having to grapple with existential concepts like this, right? Like it's just part of the developmental arc of humanity, where it's like, yeah, we're all kind of interested in this now. Like we've gone so far up Maslow's hierarchy collectively that we're at the point where enough people are interested in self-actualization and that conversation that it's now top of mind. And I think AI is probably like a reflection of that, a way to help us like understand what is conscious, what is consciousness, are we the same as machines, are we different, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I like that. And that makes a lot of sense. And it has so much to do with the Age of Aquarius too, right? I know you're also into astrology, and
Yeah.
Aquarius is all about like raising our consciousness through technology, basically. So it's an exciting time, it's a scary time, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's ultimately a good thing. I don't think anything's like inherently bad. It's whether something is destructive or productive, or sometimes destruction leads to production. So it's all, in
Yeah.
that, from like the spiritual perspective, like it just is. But I think it's catalyzing a lot of interesting conversations. And I'm seeing some really like actually genuinely interesting and good things happening already. I think that like and with past technologies, they've just been rolled out without like any conscience, and it's just like, here it is, world. Like let's figure out if it's bad afterwards. And like I do see like a coherent group of people like stepping forward to really like ring an alarm bell here about maybe we should be more mindful about how we roll this technology out, just in case it is bad, or just in case it has negative impacts that we didn't foresee. And humanity doesn't have a good history of doing that outside of indigenous cultures. So I think it's kind of like maybe that like pendulum swing went all the way to like, let's just build and destroy and figure it out later, to, hey, maybe we should have a more mindful approach to this. So I think that there's already good things coming out of it, and if it increases interest in consciousness, then I think that that's also good. So we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's focus on the positive timeline for sure. Definitely. And
Yeah,
I see it at like
cross.
choose your own adventure for every individual. Like what do you want to use this technology to empower yourself in your life and your business, or or play victim to it, So it's everyone's choice. Let's all choose the positive timeline to the best of our ability. But it can be create an amazing future, I believe, for us. Um,
Yeah.
globally, or whether it's like or whether we're creating like a parallel economy, which is yeah, a definite possibility, where there's going to be kind of different ways to live on this planet, and we can kind of choose our own adventure.
Well, I will say one thing, and I wrote this somewhere the other day in some group I'm in, and it was like, you know, I do think though that it's a little bit of a red herring. I have very mixed feelings about AI. On one level, I think it's great. On another level, I have, I'm like, if we devoted the same amount of time, energy, money, resources, focus to developing human potential, you know, then I think that that would be an infinitely more productive use of time. and energy and wiser than just solely focusing on AI, or like pursuing technology at the expense of that. And, people make arguments, well, technology will help that, but it's like the focus is on developing the tech, and that's like an ancillary thing. But if we had that much focus on like unlocking our full potential, and I've seen what's possible in that, I don't think we would need technology in the same way, or we would be able to develop it in a way that's much more benign and useful. And because yeah, I mean, we're capable of the things that iPhones are, that cell phones are, and like full spectrum, um, and so like if we spent more time developing that, I think that our overall quality of life would be exponentially better than if we spent all this time doing it like we are with AI.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And yeah, as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking how it seems like humanity has a tendency to kind of look outside of ourselves and not do the opposite, not look inwards at our own potential, and I guess accept our limiting beliefs and limitations of what we think we are. And yeah, so for some reason we look at AI as this amazing thing because we're looking outside of ourselves. But I agree with you. If we put all that tension back to ourselves and realize that we can raise our consciousness, we can unlock all these gifts, that we have on, different levels of senses that we're able to, as we rise into a new level of consciousness, that would be an amazing world as well, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
And we could probably do things way beyond what AI can do, or I know we can do that.
Yeah, maybe via a little bit different mechanism, but
Yeah,
nonetheless achieving the same outcomes, I think. So
right. So I saw that you wrote, looks like you did a lot of research about the rational mind versus the subconscious, also known as intuition. And you strike me as someone who has a very active rational mind, at least in your writing. And sometimes I've seen that people with very rational minds sometimes have maybe some difficulty trusting their intuition as well. But you seem like someone who has a strong rational mind and a deep trust in your intuition. So I found that very interesting and unique. From all the research you found, it sounds like you conclude that intuition is a superior intelligence, and that I'll read a quote here. You said neuroscientists currently estimate that our conscious minds can process about 10,000 bits of data per second. Our subconscious mind can process 65 billion bits of data per second, which is a 6,500,000 times increase in power. So that's very interesting. I'm also a big proponent of intuition and following our intuition. What's more you'd like to share on that? How can following our intuition improve our lives and our decisions?
yeah, good question. Yeah, I think, just to clarify, like, I think that you want to balance these faculties ultimately. Like, they both have their role. It's not all intuition, no rationality, all rationality, no intuition. Those are both polarities, right? And so like what I like to say is like, let your intuition lead and your mind follow, right? So intuition kind of points things a bit, gives us the direction, helps us like, sense how accurate or resonant or, on path something might be for us. And I guess I got to back up a little bit to give some more context to make that statement, more interesting. But like, in my view, why I've gotten so deep into intuition research, part of the reason why, besides just general fascination, is that, I believe that intuition is infinitely more capable and part of like this deeper implicate order intelligence that, Bohm described, or you could say, God from certain lenses, whatever. But like, it's this larger intelligence that kind of weaves through all of reality. Like a question in physics is like, the reason that Bohm came up with the idea of the implicate order is like, how the hell do you explain everything just kind of organizing itself into this beautifully coherent structure that obeys these definite laws and forms and gives rise to this insanely complex reality when it's all just like technically energy and information, bits. Like, how does that happen, right? It's like, okay, well, in the way that I see it philosophically is like there is some deeper intelligence that's informing this thing. You could think of it like a universal mind. You could think of it like God. You could think of it like, some kind of implicate order. And that thing, that intelligence has produced like this world and the entire universe, and, is able to operate at a level of sophistication and complexity that's kind of mind boggling and beyond our full understanding. So if you ask me, I think it makes more sense to align our decision making with that intelligence, and that intelligence moves through us, in my belief and perspective, and I think there's research to show that as well, via our intuition. And it's possible with our rational mind to come into conflict with that. And that's where I believe like a lot of humanity's problems come from, is that there is this kind of like deeper intelligence that's directing us one way, and then there's the mind that's has the ability to either follow that or not, that can lead us down different paths. Sometimes they're good when they're in alignment with the intuition, and sometimes they are destructive. And so and I think also just on like a raw data level, right, if something is processing 6.5 billion bits of data per second or more, right, research is like constantly bumping that number up, then, and something is only produced, analyzing 10,000 bits, like which one is more likely to give you an accurate read on something? I think the intuition. And then there's a lot of evidence to show that's the case. You can't live in absence of intuition. It's not possible. It's always there. And in fact, this is part of the reason why I believe AI cannot be fully conscious, is because it doesn't have access to intuition in the same way that we do, or at all. And so I think that like when people, and there's a lot of evidence to show that when people align their lives with intuition, like happiness goes up, all these things go up. And I want to just say one last thing, because you didn't mention it, but there's different types and levels of intuition. And there's a lot of like bad attributions in the scientific world of like just raw subconscious processing being intuition. But there's actually like deeper levels of it that go beyond that are much more accurate. So hopefully that kind of answers your question, maybe opened up some interesting avenues to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting that you said you don't believe people can turn off intuition. But I do believe, there's probably a lot of people out there that get intuitive hits, but they don't follow it. And if that compounds over years and years and decades and even a lifetime, that probably leads to things like depression and unhappiness and maybe health problems too. I can imagine. Maybe I was experiencing that back in my teens, to some degree. Yeah, for sure. I was. I would say definitely I was. Yeah. Good times. But we learned from it. So, and for me personally, it took a lot of trust and a lot of courage to like actually fully follow my intuition, because, fully following my intuition led me to do some scary things, like quit my engineering job and basically, quit my entire engineering career and, go on a totally different path and become a coach and start a podcast and do all these things that my family, my parents were like, what the hell are you doing? Like, doing all the things that were not checking off the boxes, in terms of what my family wanted me to do. So I think it's challenging for people to fully trust that, and maybe some initial limiting beliefs around following intuition could be like, well, I don't know, I just came up with this. If everyone followed their intuition, then they'd just quit their job and just be lazy or something like that. There's probably a lot of limiting beliefs that may get in the way. And my response to that is, well, maybe that would happen. And maybe that's because they would need to recover from, being in a job that's out of alignment. But then after that, like it would continue, like life doesn't just end there. The intuition continues to give you hits in terms of, what direction to go in or who to talk to and things like that.
Right.
So what kind of, conversation would you have with someone who's like struggling to fully trust their intuition?
Yeah, I mean, I usually get into their why, and I'm not trying to convince anybody. I'm
Yeah.
just doing what I believe. But if somebody's like asking me, like, "Hey, I want to live by my intuition more, but I have trouble trusting it," which does happen to me quite a bit. It's like, well, okay, well, why? And you got to dig into those reasons. And there's usually some perhaps flawed, but logical and good reason that they have for not doing it. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's they don't trust it. Sometimes they can't rationally wrap their head around it. And so, there's usually like a good conversation there that can help them get past that. But I think on some level, intuition demands trust. You know, Sometimes it's obvious that going in a direction that your intuition is telling you is probably the right move. And other times it's like it's asking you to kind of jump off a cliff with, no parachute, or it seems like there's no parachute, and risk everything. And in those times it's a lot harder. But those are the times when it really matters. And those are character building experiences and often pivotal. I also walked away. I wasn't an engineer, but I walked away from a great job. It was a dream job for me for a while. And I walked away from that at like the peak of success and, financial success and career success, to basically pursue intuitively guided dreams that, were not anywhere near as lucrative or in shape as that job was. And it took a huge leap of faith, but it ended up working out great, and I love my life. And I would have been miserable if I'd stayed in that job long term. And there was also some other crazy stuff that happened too, that were like I had this like basically 2-month window to make that decision and have really great things happen, and I happened to nail that window. In retrospect, I realized that. But so there's I've done it for so long that I've learned to just trust it, and I've done a lot of research, so it also helps me to trust it even further. But I just have like that raw time spent, and I think that anybody that puts in the raw time to just continually trust it inevitably becomes a fan, because it just produces so much fruit, and yeah, and also there, yeah, I mean, like it's just no question. And it
Yeah.
doesn't require you to let go of your rational mind at all. Like I said, like let intuition lead and your mind follow. I use my rational mind all the time. It's great. It helps me with a lot of things. But especially when I'm making like important decisions, but definitely I try to do as much as possible. It's like let that intuition guide you, because it can read so much more. It knows so much more about what could happen than your rational mind does.
Yeah, agreed. I think the main fear is it comes down to, I believe, basically the personal ego and identity. And, like you were saying, at some point, the intuition will probably guide you to do something scary, to leave some sort of position you're in right now and start something totally new. And I think it's basically going into the complete unknown and trusting that, and trusting yourself, and trusting that you can let your old identity die. I think that's the greatest fear people have, is they don't want to lose who they think they are. But that's probably the most important. You could call it a leap of faith, that can lead someone into you could say a better life, or more enjoyable, happy life, to many degrees. So yeah, learning to trust the unknown, and really trusting God and the universe. That's definitely what I had to do. And like you're saying, but allowing each time you follow that, then you can kind of record, what happened when you followed your intuition. You can start with like little things at first and then build from there. But I did that
I
back.
will say,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
will say on that wavelength, it's important to extend your time frame with intuition too, because this is the reason why like a lot of rational, like hyper rational people do not value intuition. And in fact, Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his research around intuition, but the research is deeply flawed. Good research on some level. There's some useful stuff from it, but it's also deeply flawed. But he basically compared like the accuracy of quote unquote intuitive decision making to non-intuitive decision making, rational analysis, and found that rational analysis performed better. But again, in any scientific study, you have to control for different variables. And one of the ones that they didn't do very well was control for a time variable. They didn't also control for like which type of intuition was being accessed. And the results are not totally on point. But a lot of rational people go, well, I used intuition to make this decision and it didn't turn out good. And it's like, okay, but as us intuitive decision makers know, how many times does something go not, it seems like it's going bad, but it's actually going really good when you just kind of bump the window that you're measuring whether it produced a good effect or not out further. There's a lot of people who like had a horrible accident that liberated them from a life that they hated to then, live a deeply fulfilling, successful life, aligned with their passions, right? And maybe that's not the best example because it's not an example of like an intuitive decision that was made, but it's an example of like when things initially seem like they're maybe going bad, but they actually are lining up for something much better in the future. I've had many examples of this in my life. And so intuition is like that, where it's like, if you judge it based on the immediate result, there may be times when it seems like you lose. But if you take it in stride in the long term and look at the arc of what happened, you'll see that it actually led you in a very favorable direction. And oftentimes it had you make important decisions at key moments that resulted in your success, that if you hadn't have made them, if you hadn't have followed your intuition, a string of intuitive decisions, you would have never ended up there. And that's my story personally. So I think that's really important in the conversation around intuition, is that if you're going to do it, it's not like, oh, I'm just going to dip my toe in the pond and decide in one afternoon if it works or not. You got to give it a chance. Even a week or two of consistent decision making from intuition can often produce like some significant proof that it's working in your favor. But really, you want to make a commitment to give it a shot for a little while, to give it some time to work out.
Yeah, and I'd say it's like a sword, and if or a tool, but let's say a sword. If you have like a really if you haven't really followed your intuition for your like 30 years, and then you just start to follow it, and it's going to be kind of a dull. It's not going to be really fine-tuned yet. So there's usually, and I experience this, there's a kind of a process of like, at first it's like clunky, like I'm scared, I don't know what I'm doing, like what's going on, and maybe it leads to like some negative experiences, which it did, but I had to go through that. Those are kind of, it's like riding a bike. At first you like fall over and you're like, oh, that hurts, like that's painful, but then you just got to keep using it, keep going, don't just give up. And then over time you can fine tune it. And yeah, like even still, I'm probably fine tuning intuition. It's like a lifelong process. So I think that's another thing, is you're not going to get instant results. It takes time.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I've seen people do crazy stuff with intuition, stuff that like where their life is totally on the line, and, they're completely trusting intuition and just like doing incredible things. I'm thinking of a group that I trained with where they basically teach people how to see, blind people how to see with, their via some intuitive faculty. And the people that really learn this skill to a high degree can ride a motorbike through the streets of Jakarta, okay, in rush hour traffic. I mean, they completely live their lives totally blind, but they have intuitive sight. And so, the level of risk that's possible for not just themselves, but everybody there is off the charts. I mean, it's life or death. If you're a blind person riding a bike through Jakarta, could die very easily and kill other people. So like it's high stakes. And like that's the degree that you can take intuition to. That's one of the degrees where it's that trustable when developed to that capacity. And imagine if you had that kind of certainty throughout your entire life, with a really highly developed intuition. I mean, you would be capable of incredible things, which weaves back into the original point that if we spent the amount of time and energy, money developing AI that we did developing that at scale in society, like what would be possible? I can't even imagine. So.
Jeez, you just blew my mind with driving through the streets of Jakarta blind. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. That is mind-blowing. Okay. So yeah, we just touched on intuition there. I also wanted to, I don't know the best way to segue into this, but this is a crypto astrology channel. So I think we got to dip our toes into Bitcoin and crypto as well. So what are your thoughts about Bitcoin, and do you believe it is potentially a life raft to safety during these changing times economically?
Um, well, I don't know if I would call it a life raft to safety, but I think that it's an important part of like a well-balanced portfolio. And I think that it could potentially become, the life raft to safety. I mean, it's like, is gold a life raft to safety? You know, not is any asset or investment a life raft to safety? Maybe only in yourself, in your community and like things that are tangible. But so I wouldn't exactly say that, but I do think that Bitcoin and crypto in general are like a very important disruptive innovation that is moving society in a direction that I think is really positive and on many levels. And that um, the way things are going globally in finance, and the way that things are happening in the financial system, how it's currently structured, I think Bitcoin may end up being the raft to safety, one of the rafts to safety, because it's designed in a way that's supposed to, if it functions how it's supposed to, like solve for a lot of the problems in our current financial system that are, and it's clearly having major systemic warbles right now. So, so that's a long, complicated answer to a short question, but I think it's important to be clear about these things because there's so many people in the crypto space being, big Bitcoin maxis and stuff, just saying it's the solution to everyone's problems, and it's not quite that simple, in my opinion.
Yeah, it seems like there's groups that kind of hoard around different cryptos, and it almost becomes like a religious thing or something, like the Bitcoin maxis and things like that.
Yeah, it's a cool, interesting religion.
Yeah, yeah.
And I like it, don't get me wrong. Like, but yeah, I think it's way more complicated than that. And I think that you know, also just like the volatility of Bitcoin just does not make it a safety raft. If you got in, 10, 12 years ago or whatever, yeah, okay, then it's probably going to be a safety raft for you forever. But now, you got to time things right, or you have to have a really long-term time horizon. And even then, like life happens in the interim. And so if you put all your life savings into it, it takes a 50% haircut and it takes 10 years to recover from that. Can you make do, at that much of a loss in your portfolio or whatnot? So it's more complicated than that. But I do think that Bitcoin is a super important part of humanity's future, and that it does have the potential to solve a lot of problems and ultimately like usher in a more inclusive, fair, like fundamentally sound economic system.
Hmm. And simultaneously, these days we're seeing like, conspiracy theories, but also things that really are happening, like what is it? The IMF came out with like a new crypto. I think it's called Unicoin or something. And so anyways, there's kind of simultaneously, you could say, negative timeline with crypto, and then, the centralized version of it, like CBDCs, which the United States is saying it's going to come out in July, which is very interesting. But then we also have the decentralized, like Bitcoin. I don't know if Ethereum is like fully decentralized anymore. But we could have debates about that. But how do you think this is all going to unfold? I mean, I guess it has everything to do with human consciousness, like what timeline are we going to choose as a collective,
Well, you're the astrologer, man. You tell me what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
um, well, you know, I have, okay, so like for things that are this complex, I think you can only really have like a thesis and operate from really good first principles, because if anybody had a crystal ball, then they would know all the right moves to make, and they probably wouldn't share it very widely if they did. And I think there's like some deeper reasons why it's not possible to fully know the future. Some of my friends that are quantum physicists and stuff, we talk about probability waves and what's possible to actually know. And so, but I do think I do have a thesis, I would have a couple theses around this that I think are going to play out, and they'll kind of like dictate how things go. I think one of them is the semblance of democracy thesis, which is basically saying that in Western, at least in the West, Western governments, that like the people demand and hold those governments to a semblance of democracy. And there are people that genuinely believe in the democratic process and what's right and fairness, that are in positions of power and whatnot. And so I think that in the Western world, like some of the more nefarious things that I hear about, I think it's going to be a hard pill to swallow unless there's some kind of like, false flag event to kind of sway public opinion or whatever, or maybe even not a false flag event, but something that happens that sways public opinion to wanting more kind of Orwellian, like totalitarian, to wanting that kind of economic system or government system. So I think that what I've seen in the past and what I continue to see is that like for the majority of the world, like I think crypto has a place. I don't think it's going to go away. A lot of people are like, well, they're just going to shut it down and regulate it out of existence. We're actually watching that battle happen right now. We're watching that battle happen right now. Gensler is trying to, force everything into this weird little securities regulatory box. And personally, I believe he's got an agenda to shut things down. He's got, crazy ties to Wall Street and Goldman Sachs and, all kinds of questionable sources. So I think he has an agenda personally. And so, he's trying to shut everything down, but the crypto industry is extremely well funded. And there's lots of people in the government. He just had a hearing and he just got fleeced, man. He got, taken to the cleaners and back by a lot of different representatives and senators from different states and stuff. And so, and they're fighting back, man. They're fighting back. I think that semblance of democracy thesis is in action right now, where like, this is not going to happen without a fight. And people are watching, people in power are watching what's happening. And so I think that, they might develop CBDCs. I mean, it's, for all intents and purposes, they're very much set on launching them maybe even this year. But I think they're going to have a really hard time, putting these kinds of controls in place where they're like, doing weird behavioral economic stuff where they're trying to like, well, you can only spend, you're going to get a UBI, but you can only spend it on this or that or whatnot. They might try, but I just don't think that people are going to take that. I mean, like who in their, I can see people that like really are in a difficult economic situation taking money like that because they just are so desperate that they need to do it. But I think for most people, and even a lot of people in that situation, it's like, really, we're going to give up all of our freedom, for this. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think there's going to be enough people that are against it that it's not going to happen. So I guess we're kind of getting into how things are unfolding. So I think that cryptos are going to continue to rise in strength, in power. Blockchain is going to continue to rise in strength, power, and influence. And it's going to somehow integrate with the existing financial system, or maybe even, if that has enough problems and crypto has developed far enough along, it might even start to replace it at some point. I personally believe that and invest to that degree,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, astrologically, Pluto's in Aquarius, and so it's going to be, I mean, so we're heading into a revolution sort of energy collectively, where it's the power to the people, but
Right.
it is going to retrograde another 2 times back into Capricorn. So then we are going to kind of, it's a very transformative time the next year and a half. So it's going to be transforming. There's probably going to be a lot of transformation with crypto and technology and AI being introduced.
Right.
Man, I mean, we could definitely see an economic collapse, dare I say, of some sort, or a correction. Yeah, and lots of changes. So this is just a major turning point the next year and a half. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I personally believe like you want to be well diversified because, like there's so much, there's so many different possibilities. Like it's really getting very difficult. Like I think, 50 years ago, even 100 years ago, even 20 years ago, it was a lot easier to kind of predict with a higher degree of accuracy what was going to happen. But there's so many different influences that are at play right now. I mean, there's just like crypto is a disruptive technology that has not fully played out. The internet's a disruptive technology that's still disrupting. It's been around for 20, 30 years now, in significant use, and it's not even done disrupting our culture yet. And then you have AI that's stacking on top of this, and social media. So the level of simultaneous disruptive innovation that's happening, and not including what we're going through like psychospiritually as a result of that, and what we've done to the planet as a result of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, when you take all those things into consideration, like it's getting near impossible to predict like with specificity what's happening. So how do you deal with that kind of risk and uncertainty? Like, you have to kind of diversify and plan for different situations. So you have to kind of run that gamut, different game theories, different situations that could play out, and be like, okay, well, if this, kind of generally probable timeline plays out, what does well, what doesn't do well? What would I need to thrive? What wouldn't I need to thrive? Where would I want to be? Where wouldn't I want to be? Right. So you kind of have to kind of run those scenarios. And this is the rational approach, right? This is the rational approach. Run the scenarios and then diversify your portfolio based upon what will give you the most likelihood of success. But this, I think, is where there's a really strong case for intuition, is that like, even with really good rational analysis, even throwing AIs on it and machine learning and think tanks and all this shit, like, you still max out. You still like there's a limit, a hard limit to what you can predict with the rational mind. Even if you get it's like, if you do the math, you say, well, if the conscious mind, the rational mind, produces 10,000 bits a second per data, processes that much data, we're like, well, if I just get enough people thinking about it, then I can outdo intuition. But it doesn't work like that. It's not logarithmic. You get more people together, they're just maxing out on how many possible scenarios the mind can process. So maybe you get up to like 1 million bits of data per second, but you're still way below intuition. Plus, intuition's personalized for you, and your situation is different than other people. So, what's good risk management for one person is not good risk management for another person. So I think that intuition is really shines now. Like, you have to kind of be marrying your intuition with your rational analysis, or you're dead in the water, man. Unless you have like a bulletproof rational plan that you stick to. Like, I still think you're very much gambling, and that you got to bring intuition in, even like, diversification. Like, what do you diversify into? What can you afford? All these questions. So long answer, but I think that this is a time where it's like, things are getting so complex that it forces us to use intuition. Otherwise, you just go into like analysis paralysis. What do you
Yeah,
do?
like complete overwhelm, adrenal
Yeah.
fatigue, which I think probably a lot of people are dealing with.
Yeah, and I think this is, there's a huge rise in like mental illness, and there's a lot of reasons why that could be. But I think one of them is that like, it's becoming overwhelming to live in a society that has so much complexity with so much existential risk possible, because of the lack of spiritual and like cultural maturity of our civilization.
Yeah, maybe the most valuable thing we can do is sit and meditate and go inwards.
It wouldn't be a bad idea. It's like, honestly, I wonder sometimes, I'm like, I think this is a byproduct of capitalism, is essentially like this breakneck, like hyper competitive, well, we got to use AI because if we don't, then somebody else will, and they'll take over us. And it's all driven by maintaining, some kind of control, power, or revenue. And it's producing all kinds of unintended effects because it doesn't have a conscience. Like, we rely on government to basically regulate in conscience, or the individual to like have a conscience, but it's not like fundamentally built into like the economic and social agreement field. And so, so I think that like that's creating this like hyper speed race where we don't have time to really sit with what the negative effects might be. I think this is where indigenous cultures really shined. In theory, they could have ended up in the same, and again, I don't want to like, whitewash everything and say that all indigenous cultures did this, but a lot of them did. And like, there's no reason why they couldn't have theoretically gotten into like a capitalistic race with each other, but they culturally valued, and it was much more life or death for them. If they made a mistake, they didn't have all these layers of infrastructure to protect them from the realities of like not having food or environment. So they had to be really wise in how they made decisions. They had to be methodical. So they, is that plant edible or not? Don't just go eat the whole plant, because if you don't, somebody else is. It's like it's like not a good way to approach things. You got to be really methodical and intentional. And so if we took on that value as a culture, and meditated more and say like, okay, well, let's like think about things before we just run out there and implement them, because there's this, crazy breakneck drive for capital. It's like, if we could just like somehow weave that in more. I think that tide is shifting, that is happening a lot. But like, if we could culturally like all self-regulate and do that, or kind of build some checks and balances or other incentive structures into capitalism to incentivize that, we would be so much better off. There's like our standard of living, our quality of life is pretty great right now. There's not like an urgent need to desperately make it 1,000 times better. It's like, as long as everyone's like alive and thriving and has their needs met, and in order to be able to kind of like focus on self-actualization and creativity and whatnot, like we're good. And that's possible with the level of technological innovation we already have.
Absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes people in indigenous cultures, they might be a lot happier people than many of the people in the Western world. I think there's some studies on that. And I've seen it with my own eyes too, going to more, you could say, impoverished places. Sometimes people seem way more happier, like just looking at their faces and stuff.
For sure.
Yeah. So you did say on your website, I saw that you believe we're heading towards a golden age of peace and prosperity. So, and I also want to ask you, do you envision yourself like, because I have a vision. This is the vision I've got. I think it's a collective vision too that I've tuned into. Is like, you could call it New Earth communities, or like a web of communities being created around the world, where you could say we're living sustainably together. We're living more consciously, more cooperatively, in harmony with nature, you could say. And AI and technology can be a big part of that as well, as like, to aid us in doing that, in creating a sustainable world. Is that part of your vision and the direction you feel like you're going in?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's on the website, just to be clear, is that that like, part of my purpose is to help usher that in. I do believe on a long enough time scale that we are headed towards a golden age of peace and prosperity. I think it's up to us to decide how quickly that is created
Yeah.
and best. Um, and my personal belief is that is like, I like to play judo with life, right? I like to do judo with life. Like, in judo, you don't resist anything. Somebody's charging you, you use their momentum to kind of flip them over, right? And it's like, okay, for whatever reason, the way that human history is unfolded, we're in a reality where AI is out. The cat's out of the bag. Okay, so might as well use it for the maximum possible benefit. And I suppose if somebody really has like a particular, desire to kind of fight it, then by all means, that's their choice to go ahead and do that. But I think that like, AI again, like I think the risk with AI is less about, is it good or is it bad? It's like how we use it. What I'm concerned about, in part, on one level, is that human collectively, we're not a very mature species. And there's a lot of people out there, there's a lot of bad actors out there that would love to use it for a nefarious thing. Hell, our governments, I'm sure, would love to do that, and for a lot of purposes. And so, so there's a lot of push towards using things in ways that are like questionable on one level. On another level, like, I believe that that's all part of the great unfolding, and that even if something negative happens, we're going to learn from it and ideally create something better the next time around. So I think it's going to be ultimately positive. But I do think that, and this is the third level, and I think this is what I hold as a vision for us, is that it is possible for us to kind of like use these things maturely and intelligently, and to weave it into like a more holistic like perspective on reality. So I would personally, where I put my time is to like figure out ways that how we can do that. Like, what are the leverage points that we can press in our own lives, collectively, in our work, to help humanity like go up to that third tier of functioning, where it's like we can have the AI and use it for pretty much only positive things,
Mm-hmm.
like that's my hope and dream and goal, and what I'm working towards. So hopefully we all collectively jump up there sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks a lot, Justin, for coming on the show today. This was
Awesome,
fun.
man. Thanks for coming to me. Yeah, great chat.